if you're interested in what I say today. He is an extraordinarily brilliant theologian. So quite apart from the fact that his life and thought, among other things, unleashed the William Carey beginning of the modern missionary movement, what he said insightfully and biblically about so many things in its own right will go on having an impact upon the church. And who knows what God may breathe upon a century from now in causing someone to read the gospel worthy of all acceptation and explode with effect upon the 22nd century world. We don't know about such things. God may do it, or He may use you to do it in a way you never dreamed. His impact has been, will be, far beyond a little pastorate in Kettering, England. 3,000 people, 32-year investment in the pastorate in Kettering. What an amazing thing God did. So the modern missionary movement, and released through his life and his thought in a way, along with other things, that was extraordinary. Andrew Fuller died May 7, 1815, age 61. Relevant. That's how old I am. So if I were to drop dead while I'm speaking, I would be in good company, because I've had way more than I deserve, including so many things, including you. He'd been a pastor for 32 years at Kettering, some years before that in Soham. Before that, a boy growing up on a farm with his parents, devout Baptist parents, no formal theological education whatsoever, and yet the number one theologian among the particular Baptists, that is, the Calvinistic Baptists of his day. 17 years old, begins to preach in Soham, and then they call him to be their pastor when he was 21 years old, and then he moves to Kettering, where he spent the rest of his ministry. The year after he became a pastor, he married Sarah Gardner, 1776, a date that means something to Americans, just clue you into what's going on in the world. America's becoming independent this year when he marries Sarah Gardner. 16 years later, she dies, and in that 16 years, she had 11 children, and 8 of them died. 2 months before she died, Fuller, together with Ryland and Carey and the others, a little band of Baptist pastors, founded the Baptist Missionary Society, and then she died. And I thought to myself, it's so often that way. The greatest birth, the greatest triumphs, and the greatest losses back to back. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. And if it dies, it could unleash 2 centuries of stunning missionary enterprise. So during those 40 years of pastoral ministry in Soham and Kettering, he tried to do far more than one man can do well. He tried to raise a family, 3 kids instead of 11. He tried to pastor a church. He tried to engage the destructive doctrinal errors of his day with writing, and he led the Baptist Missionary Society, which was founded in 1792. He regularly felt absolutely overwhelmed. He wrote a letter in 1801, born 1754, so you can do the math as we do these things, 47 years old. He wrote this: Samuel Pierce's memoirs are now loudly called for, meaning everybody wants me to write them because He's part of this band, and I know him well. I sit down almost in despair. My wife looks at me with a tear ready to drop and says, "My dear, you have hardly time to speak to me." My friends at home are kind, but they also say, "You have no time to see us or know us, and you will soon be worn out." Amidst all this, there is, "Come to Scotland, come to Portsmouth, come to Plymouth, come to Bristol." So a little band of brothers, Baptist pastors, tiny little churches, burning with zeal for the global cause of God, found this mission society in 1792, October 2. And Fuller, more than them all, felt the burden that when William Carey, John Thomas get on that boat with their wives and go, never to return, not a single furlough, he felt the burden unbelievably. Nobody had done this in a long time. You've heard the phrase, perhaps you know it comes from Fuller, that we at home are rope holders. It comes from Fuller. And I'll give you the situation and the quote from which it comes. Our undertaking in India, this is Fuller talking, our undertaking in India really appeared to me on its commencement to be somewhat like a few men who were deliberating about the importance of penetrating into a deep mine which had never been explored. We had no one to guide us. And while we were thus deliberating, Carey, as it were, said, "Well, I will go down if you will hold the rope." But before he went down, he, as it seemed to me, took an oath from each of us at the mouth of the pit to this effect, that while we lived, we should never let go the rope. So for 21 years, Fuller served as the General Secretary of the Baptist Missionary Society and held that rope more firmly, more zealously than anyone else held it, with greater conscientiousness and a greater sense of responsibility. I've got to raise this money. I've got to raise prayer support. So when you heard those words in his desperation, come to Bristol, come to Portsmouth, come to Plymouth, come to Scotland. Those are people who believe in the mission saying, come talk to our people, come speak to our churches, come inspire our people. You're a good speaker. We need you to come. He went 5 times to Scotland. He traveled continuously, speaking to raise support for the mission. He wrote for the periodical accounts. He wrote for the Baptist General Annual Register. He wrote for the Evangelical Magazine. He wrote for the Baptist Magazine. He had the lead role in choosing more missionaries to go out and interviewing them. He carried an extensive correspondence between himself and the missionaries, as well as to people at home. All of that while knowing his pastoral work was suffering. He didn't have any assistant until 1810. 5 years before he died. He got an assistant, John Hall. 1811. 4 years before he died. October 1794, he lamented in a letter to John Ryland how the mission work was compromising his pastoral labor. He said, I long to visit my congregation, that I may know of their spiritual concerns and preach to their cases. There are some amazing quotes where he tips his heart hand about the affection that he had for his people. Here's one. He's writing to one of the wayward members. When a parent loses a child, and you know what kind of experience he's talking out of. When a parent loses a child, nothing